Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Eve Hayes de Kalaf of the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies, which is part of the Institute of Modern Languages Research at the University of London. And we've asked Eve to come and talk to us today, really following on from the recent publication of her book on the legal identity, race and belonging challenges in the Dominican Republic. And the thing that really struck me about that and some of the work that I've been reading around it is how we need to be really careful about the law of unintended consequences when we roll out identity programs. And we can often be guilty of getting very excited about the latest gadgets and the latest technologies that are going to make things efficient for everyone involved. But actually, as we've often said at Women in Identity, there's a huge human impact and often there's a lot of unintended consequences. So we've invited Eve to talk to us about what those might be and what her warnings and challenges to the industry could be. So Eve, welcome. All the members will be very excited to hear from you. And really what I wanted to just sort of first of all open up with is, how did you get to where you are today? Well, where did the younger Eve start out?
Well, firstly, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. I'm really looking forward to this interview. So where did I start out? Well, my journey really didn't start with identity or ID management at all, and it really has been a huge journey in the sense that I started out working in the mid-2000s in the Caribbean, across the Caribbean and Latin, Central America, and I was living at the time in the Dominican Republic, and essentially following on from kind of many years of working in, I was a communications consultant. I did projects that were involved that had links to people like the World Bank, the UN, and others. And essentially it was something that was always in the back of my mind. It was something that I was seeing developing there. And I didn't really know what was happening. And I think what's so so encouraging, really, I think, in terms of the journey that I've taken, is that once I started learning in a scholarly way, once I started reading and learning about the history of the Caribbean and the importance of the centrality of the Caribbean in terms of its importance, it was the administrative hub during the slave trade, how the huge impact that had on questions of race and people's sense of belonging, but also about the wider world, the global implications of that whole structure. That just became a very interesting and exciting journey for me to kind of have the practical ground experience, but then the academic underpinnings that then gave me the opportunity to move forward and develop this idea for the book.
Yeah, so the identity is very much at its most fundamental there, isn't it? Because that, as you say, that whole interplay between the Caribbean populations and all the different islands and sort of nationalities there, but then the whole colonial overlay as well, when we've seen things recently like Windrush and so on that have had massive impact when it comes to how people have looked at the whole identity question. So you mentioned the United Nations, obviously the sustainability goals for 2030 are to give everybody a legal identity, which sounds very laudable, sounds absolutely the right thing to do. We've talked long and hard in the past about the need for birth registration documents for every child. What worries you about that? What concerns do you have about the whole kind of?
I have many concerns. And well, essentially my book is is a cautionary tale, and I think it's very important to look at the Dominican case within the broader debate around Sustainable Development Goal 16.9, which calls for a legal identity for all, and is measured along the lines of birth registration. So very much the focus within development discourse has been talking about the need to identify and to document children. So, and the point of the kind of focus of that is, for example, that the state, the civil registry needs to intervene at places like birth clinics to encourage women to give birth in hospitals rather than at home. It's at schools as well to ensure that children have a birth certificate so that they can then have access to an education. So the underpinning logic there initially makes sense. If you're trying to think, and also because birth registrations as well are very important in terms of what has been referred to as vital statistics. So the fact that anybody, so statisticians, sorry, say that word, development experts, academics such as myself, or people that work with quantitative data particularly, then have access to know, how many children there are in the world, who we're talking about, where they are, and to identify them. So that the logic of that we need to identify everybody in order to ensure and facilitate access is an important one. But then that's where it's also a problematic question. Because as history has clearly taught us, that once that essentially by giving states tools helping facilitate the en masse registration of people is also inevitably, and while it's going to include people who states, for example, consider and recognise as citizens, it can also and will inevitably also lead to exclusion. And citizenship is a very slippery concept. It's something that maybe many of us take for granted, and it can be quite a westernized concept as well, the assumption that everybody's registered and that everyone has access to some form of ID, when in fact for many years most of the world it was the opposite. So most of the world were very informal, were undocumented, had no form of legal existence. So what we've seen essentially is a flip in not just, well, in global policy as well, but also in the way in which we're dealing with people. And obviously then when we're talking about digital technologies, when we're talking about how people are identified, it can be in terms of in gender, we can think about maybe non-binary people, and also systems that help or facilitate the flagging up of people's ethnic and national origins. And we know, that this already has been problematic. And the obvious case to talk about would be that, Nazi Germany, where Jews were bureaucratically stripped of their German citizenship and told they were no longer German. You have the case of Rwanda. You have the case of a contemporary case, for example, would be the Rohingya in Myanmar, or Assam in India, Somalis in Kenya, etc. So these are not these cases of like examples of contestations are erupting now. They're coming to the fore specifically because there has been this push to ensure that everybody is being identified.
Do you think as an industry we're too focused on registering everybody, and actually the ability to actually digitally put everybody in some sort of data bank, so that's all nice and neat and tidy, and we worry less? What we should be worrying about is actually how we recognize people. Can people be recognized rather than people be registered? If you get my drift, it's that back to that point about it's what people want to do once they've been registered, once they have their identity document.
Exactly. I think that the danger here is that there's an assumption, particularly within international development policy, that an ID is the solution. So it was the solution to everything, whereas really ID is just a means to an end. The end should really be, Laura Van Bass, who is the director of the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion, has talked about this. But the idea that it should be about unlocking access to services. So if an ID serves to mean that somebody can graduate from high school, for example, or it means that they can open a bank account, or it can facilitate them getting married, or whatever they need to do, or accessing healthcare services, or in the case of COVID, for example, getting vaccinations. Then these things are crucial. But if the process to obtain an ID is not facilitating access to these things, then we have a problem. And the case of the Dominican Republic, I think, is a very important one, because what the book identifies is that for over 80 years, the state had been registering people and giving birth certificates to people born to migrant parents and of Haitian descent in the country. And in 2013, a constitutional tribunal ruling effectively backtracked and said, you know, since 1929, we've been recording people within the civil registry, but we did that in error. So, you know, so hundreds of thousands of people might have thought that they not just thought they were citizens and had ID as citizens, but in fact, we gave them the paperwork to say they're citizens. Yeah. And this is very worrying, I think, when these kind of cases can come to light. And it's not, I think my motivation as well for the Dominican case was that it's not, I think a lot of people talk about it as an anomaly, whereas I am kind of saying it's kind of a sign of where the direction is going. Yeah. So if we think about, for example, you know, children born to parents of Latin American descent, for example, in the US, and the idea that the onus is now on the individual to prove that they were born in the US to then be able to get their documents. These are the kind of problems that when there's an overemphasis on the need to identify everyone, that, you know, if you show an ID card, you're in, and if you don't show an ID card, you're out. Then these can be quite exclusionary and quite worrying. There's a space there basically for these things to be used to the detriment of abuse, and not just for the benefit. And this needs to be talked about in the industry. Absolutely needs to be acknowledged, recognised, and debated as well.
I can see that, because you know, you said that basically, you know, mass registration leads to permanent exclusion for many people. So you know, are we looking at it the wrong way to be trying to create mass systems that will, you know, handle everything really super efficiently? And if that is the case, you know, we're going to have to look at it differently. What are you seeing from some of the communities that you've worked with that might be alternatives to simply putting in huge, big identity systems at a national level?
Yeah, I think part of the argument that I'm making, I mean, the book doesn't draw any really strong concrete conclusions. Part of what I want to do is to introduce the reader to this problem, really, and to guide them through questions of, you know, what we're going to do about it. So I call it, for example, in the first chapter, I call it an underappreciated revolution, because this is something that I think it's Lawrence Chandy of UNICEF mentioned in a tweet basically a few years ago. But this idea that actually this is a really a huge shift in the way that we are administrations and bureaucracies are dealing with people, and it's happened so quickly that we haven't given ourselves time to, I think, take a stand back and listen to the voices of the people who are experiencing these systems. And that's not to say it's not overly, you know, that some people, it's been transformative for them. For some people, they spent many years trying to get their ID, and now they've got it. It's been a very important, and that's the message that for example, the World Bank and the United Nations, their messaging around this would certainly promote that position. But we also need to listen to people who have scores of people that I spoke to who, you know, see this as a form of, you know, it's a form of bureaucratic torture in the sense that you can be sent. And if you're thinking about people who are living in extremely vulnerable environments as well. So the idea that you're telling somebody that they need to pay for a bus to then go to the capital, to then get a document, to then seek legal counsel, to then take a photocopy, to then get it legalized, you know, all of these things that might seem straightforward, but actually the layers of privilege that are needed for us to even get to the point of having a birth certificate, an ID card, or a passport are multiple, are very complex, and are not universally experienced. They're not universal for everybody.
No, I think we're really conscious of that, and in fact, I don't know if you're aware, but we've launched a code of conduct sort of project. That'll be one of the outputs at the end of it, but at the moment we're at the stage of looking at the stories of exclusion and the human impact of identity exclusion, where one of the recent videos we put out was a transgender woman in Ghana who's experienced all the things you're talking about, you know, having to carry 4 or 5 different identity documents with her all the time because this one doesn't look like you and that one doesn't look like you, and you know, just not being able to accommodate the realities that people live in, you know, and the way they have to live their lives.
Yeah, and this is I think people used to talk to me about the civil registry being a bureaucratic mess, but also the way that when you know, en masse identifications and registrations were being rolled out, it leads to confusion because people don't understand, they don't know how to navigate. Many people do. That's not to take away their that's not to take anything from people, but it's very complex for people to understand what government building to go to, you know, what how to get the paperwork from their grandma or their great grandma, for example, how to, or even granddad, because the fact that, you know, in many countries nationality is passed through the father, not the mother.
Right.
Problems with statelessness as well, where people have no form of legal existence whatsoever, so effectively they're not being owned by any state because they're not seen to exist, so they're effectively living as legal ghosts. So while ID systems are kind of pushed as being the solution to this, again, I'm repeating myself a little bit, but we need to see that the nuances, listen to firstly the lived experience of people going through it. What are the problems they're reporting and why are they experiencing problems? But also what are some of the benefits? What are they saying? This is working.
It does work. Yeah.
This is working. This is a good thing. But also this is causing issues or problems. Well, then let's recognise it. And I think that sadly, we haven't got to that point yet. I don't think we're listening at the moment. I think there's been such a push for ID is going to solve everything. We're going to use it as a mantra in international development, and it's just SDG goal 16.9 is just going to solve everyone's problem. Well, that's clearly not the case. And we need to get to that point where we're having these difficult conversations.
And who do you think needs to be in those conversations? Is it the tech companies? Obviously, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the power and the control that some of our big tech platforms have. You know, is it governments? How do we allow for interoperability, you know, across regions and all of that? It's who do you think is missing from the conversations at the moment?
That's an excellent question. So in my book, I talk about the need to examine the interconnectedness of these systems with broader architectures. And these can be at a state level and also at a global level. So really, I think it's a question of identifying who are the key people. So, for example, tech companies are largely invisible in this whole question. They might be the ones in the background doing the, you know, putting things, the programs together, but they're not at the table really. So, absolutely, we need to bring all of the major stakeholders to the table to talk, have a difficult conversation about some of these problems. So we need, as I said, we need to look at the interconnectedness of it. We need to see how these structures work at both a national and a global level, but we also need to think about the people who maybe are not the ones developing the policy, and they might not be the ones who are thinking about some of the complicated questions around questions of identity and race and belonging. But they need to be part of this. And I find I gave a conference recently at the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. We did a conference called Reimagining Belonging in Latin America and beyond. And what was so interesting from that conference is one of the speakers talked about how our data doesn't see borders. So the fact that even the nationality laws and the way that we're registering people is very much about state borders and people states identifying who their citizens are, but the way the data is managed and the way it's being processed and the way it's being stored, it's nothing to do with borders whatsoever. It goes completely beyond that. And I thought that was a really, really fascinating way of thinking about this, is that, well, you know, actually, if we're just looking at what's happening within you know, a certain country, and just looking at that certain idea, or the, you know, how people are experiencing it because of that state's nationality laws, or because of the way that the state has been modernizing, let's say, its civil registry, we're not going to get the bigger picture. We need to look at it from a global perspective, and we need to understand how ID systems are playing out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, surely it's that, you know, it's just even the interoperability of sort of vaccine certificates between one domain and another, you know, is already throwing up all sorts of issues. I think it's become the whole question around identity and ID registration documents is becoming much more clear to people, because they can see the impact that even at the vaccine and the COVID level, you know, what happens there when it goes wrong, when it's not recognized from one domain to another. So yeah, I think there's a lot of lessons being learned at the moment, hopefully for good. But one thing we haven't touched on, and it comes out in some of the work you've been doing, is the role of unconscious and conscious bias. Obviously, where people do have very specific ideas, and perhaps systems have been designed consciously or otherwise to create barriers. What's been your experience, particularly in the regions where you've worked in the Caribbean?
About unconscious and conscious
that where
bias.
unconscious bias has been built into the system as well.
I think when I started really taking an interest in ID documents, I think the one thing that really resonated with me was the linkage between ID and the authoritarian state. So dictatorships for decades have used ID cards as a means to either control or keep certain groups in their space, and so it always concerned me. There was always an alarm bell ringing in the back of my head when I started studying and learning more about this kind of universal rollout of ID, because of course if there are predatory states, and if there are states who want to use it, you know, they will use it for whatever means they deem they want to. So that's what that's where the warning signs were with me, was, you know, if you look at the socio-historical content, the ID card, when it's used for bad, I mean, again, I've said Nazi Germany, but it's very clearly, you know, we know where that can lead. So the fact that we've kind of walked into this, I'm not sure if it's blindly. I'm currently doing a research project looking at where legal identity kind of developed in international development discourse, and why it's become so prioritized now. So I'm still learning about that. But the fact that we kind of it just kind of seemed to become integrated within the SDGs as this will solve everything. Is I've always found that very, very interesting, that we need to start taking this apart a bit more, and it needs to be open to more criticism. Yeah,
and I was interested in one of the stories that the case studies that you cited, where there's, I think it's a young guy out in of Afro-Caribbean descent in the Dominican Republic, who didn't really care whether he got an ID or not, but he was constantly being stopped by the police. And then when he needed to get his documentation sorted, you know, he was being told he needed to cut his hair and he needed to change his look, and it's a lot of that, I think, which we also haven't spent enough time discussing. How do we make people comfortable even just with the whole ID process?
It's deeply disturbing. It's deeply disturbing that people can that an ID is not just about affecting someone's, you know, about their, it can be about have an impact on someone's person. So the fact that someone's told to cut their hair, I think I talk about this quite a lot in the book, you know, and the connotations of that, and kind of the how historically like loaded with such trauma that is very upsetting, I think. But as you said, it's important for this I think it's important that we talk about the informal economy, because obviously when we think about like a cashless society and our move towards a cashless society, well, the negotiations that take place in the informal economy, you know, in the cash economy is really crucial. So this guy, he just wanted his job. He just wanted to keep his job. He was a bouncer at a nightclub, and he wanted to be paid. He wanted to make sure that he got his, you know, cash in hand every month and could just go about his business. And he was getting very angry with the fact that it was getting, and we're living in a society where it's getting more and more difficult to live this informal existence, because the system is increasingly pulling us in, whereby it's saying we need to have an ID so that we can open a bank account, so that we can have so that we can get paid our wages into our bank account, so that we can have access to a pension. And I know for some listeners that this might seem the most obvious thing in the world, but it isn't for a lot of, we're huge, I mean, millions of the world's population. This is not how they have negotiated, how they lived, how they've interacted for ever.
And possibly don't want to as well. They culturally may not be, you know, in the same sort of space and place where a lot of the Western culture is all deemed around efficiency, make everything efficient, and we want to get it done quickly and easily and hassle-free. But actually, not every community works that way.
Yeah, and one of the main themes that came up time and time again was this idea of tiredness and also apathy, because people saw it as, you know, well, I was getting on fine with my life, but then this person, you know, came and knocked on my door and said I needed to. Some people assumed that it was for the census, for example. They asked me, because they did house-to-house surveys, and they asked me how many children I had, and then they came back to check, you know, to check how I was living and my documents, and they said, I just want to get on with life. Why has this become so difficult? And a very important point that I think we don't think about when we're thinking about universal ID is what happens to people when they die as well. What happens to all those documents? You know, and civil registries have, in many contexts, been mismanaged. You know, the paperwork has disintegrated, or, you know, been poorly archived or disappeared because of a storm, a storm or whatever. But the point being that the physical documentation, obviously now it's on a computer database, is a complete game changer in terms of how we're dealing with people's ID. Sorry, I think I just talked over you. You just said something.
No, you're okay. No. What I wanted to ask was bring it back to the tech community, because obviously a lot of our members will work in the tech space, or will be at least implementing some of these big solutions. So what would your advice be to the CEOs of say, our sponsoring companies, or, you know, what as a researcher who's worked in this space, who's very close to the people on the ground who are affected by what goes in, and bearing in mind you've said that we're not at the table well enough to be part of the debate. What other kind of advice and guidance do you think is missing for the tech firms?
I've already touched upon it in this call, but start talking to people. Start talking to people of their experiences, and form that as if that's part of your remit. For example, you might be rolling out I don't know, the technological side of something, but you need to have that space within your policy design to be thinking about or to be asking people how they experience this. And I think without that consideration, then then these things are, because there are nuances that you won't pick up on, that people have you know, that people have encountered. I'm trying to think of some examples now, but you know, there was one, I know we've talked about non-binary people, but there was one man who was actually registered erroneously as a woman on his ID, and he was, through these new processes, he was able to be registered as a man. Now that for him was important, but for other people there'll be other issues that they need looking at. And if these things are just being treated in a very impersonal way, so if people are being treated as if they're just a name or a statistic on a computer screen, and their stories are not being listened to, they're not being heard, they're not being dealt with, it just leads to, I think it leads to a lot of it's just not treating people, I think, in a way that they deserve.
Well, and back to that, we don't know what the consequences of that might be down the line, you know, actually, where you have people who are just not engaged with the process because it's too much of a systemic technological or tick the box exercise, and not about who I am as a human, you know.
Yeah, that's certainly the reaction I got from people was, I'm so fed up with this system. I'm fed up with people knocking on my door. I'm fed up with being sent from pillar to post, you know, with paying my own money to get public transport to go and sort out, you know, but that's something. Why? Because before this wasn't a problem. Why is this a problem now? And then one of the quite prominent journalists I spoke to, Juan Bolivar Diaz, his name is, he spoke about the fact that I've just completely lost my train of thought. You might have to get that.
That's all right, we'll come back to it.
Oh yeah, he spoke about elderly people as well. So I know he spoke about dead people, but elderly people, you know, people who've lived their own, they might say that they're married, for example, but they've never really got any form of marriage certificate. And they might say that you know, they've worked in a place for 40 years, but they've got no contract or proof of documentation. And this is suddenly they're finding they can't access their pensions, or they're being told that they're not married to their partner. These are huge things.
Human issues. And I wonder if that's because we're sort of in this transition phase between being analog and the full world of digital, which if we did get to universal registration of every child at birth in a formal way, we wouldn't be there in 30, 40 years time. But we're in this no man's land moment where we have systems that, you know, are relying on digitizing something, but that something doesn't exist. And, you know, to your point, there isn't a document or there isn't a civil sort of registration process that existed really before. So, yeah, lots to chew over there. Coming back to you then, just as we wrap up, what's next? What are you researching? You've mentioned you're getting quite tucked into the whole world of identity by the signs of things. What do you think is coming up next?
Yeah, so I thank you for that question. I recently, earlier this year, organised a big conference, as I said, looking at access to citizenship, digital identity and rights. And that was specifically in the Latin American context. So I'm really interested in the Americas, purely because I think people who are working on this subject are very much focused on Africa, on Southeast Asia, on different cases they're finding in Europe. But actually, the Americas is kind of lagging behind, and this I find very interesting because it was the place where many of the flagship development programs actually took place. So that's what I want to learn. I want to understand where these systems came from, why there's been such overwhelming importance placed on these policies within global governance now, within the SDGs. And that's basically what I'm interested in, and seeing and also talking about not just the contents of the book really, but the broader questions that the book that the book kind of touched upon,
brings together.
That's really which I think affect us all. And I recently wrote an article in which I talked about, you know, the fact that a homeless man, for example, he can't catch a bus because they take card payments, not cash, or, you know, an African American woman who's trying to vote, but she can't vote because she doesn't have the right form of user ID that is required, or that is demanded. So, you know, it's how ID systems can be, how states can play ID systems to really either forget about, invisibilize, or push out certain segments of their populations that they don't want to think about. And obviously, I look at migrant descended people, so people who were born in situ, but whose parents or grandparents or great grandparents might have been migrated from elsewhere. But this is also a very important case, of course, for people who cross borders as well as people who are living within them. So it really is something that is going to affect all of us. And
I think you're right. I think as more and more things, you know, we move on and we see these changes in systems, so we just recognize each time there's another group we've left behind, or another group that we haven't thought about with every new digital, you know, innovation that comes through. So Ava, thank you so much. It's been fabulous talking to you. I think you've challenged us to think a little bit more and differently as a sector. It's something that women in identity are very aware of. You mentioned to me earlier that you've had quite a productive year. Not only have you had your book published, but you've also produced a beautiful little girl. So what would, you know, if you were looking forward, or maybe perhaps looking back to your younger self, and I'm thinking about the advice you would give to a woman now, or a young girl coming, through the systems and knowing all the things that you do about the world of work. What's your advice to the women out there?
I think that's an excellent question. I was afraid for many years to actually write. I didn't have the confidence in myself or in my knowledge or my skill set to think that I actually had something to say. So I'm 40 now, and it took me a long journey and a long time to also the experience of living in the Caribbean, and what people in the Dominican Republic, what a rich place it was just to have to bring out these stories and these people's experiences. So I feel like I'm in a total position of I feel very humbled and in a position of privilege to be able to articulate and to now find a framework within which I can actually talk about these issues. But I think for my younger self, I'd be like, don't be afraid to write, don't be afraid to make mistakes, don't be afraid of if you find it, we all have huge gaps in our knowledge. Well, then learn, read more, find out about it. Be curious. But I find it's very a nice thing to be 40 and to think, now's time that I really want to get this book out. But it's not, the book isn't about me. The book is about
it's a fabulous,
the richness of people and their experiences and what they've shared with me. And it's I was really motivated in getting their voices heard, basically by people such as yourself and people within the sector. And for that, it's been a very long journey. And in the book, I think I say it's something that it's a journey that began in the Dominican Republic and has taken me around the world. So it's something that's really blown up, something that people might have dismissed as being quite a small case or something, but actually it resonates with so many global
people.
issues.
And I think that's very much what we believe here as well. We don't tell the stories enough, and we don't tell them well enough, and that's why we've embarked on this campaign, as I say, and we've been recently putting together videos of the excluded people who have been challenged or excluded from the systems. So your book and all the things we've read about in that just sits alongside so beautifully, and it really inspired us as well. So thank you very much for all of that.
This one, I think, because it's not just about excluded people, and it's also looking at the experiences of people who've had for whom ID really has been transformative as well. So it's about, that's why I interview people across different socioeconomic backgrounds and across, basically I want to know, living in all sorts of situations, but I want to hear how this interconnected system that I talk about has affected them. So it's not just saying this group is excluded, but it's also saying, well, what is working and how is it working?
How can we make it work for everybody? Absolutely. Because there are clearly pockets of real excellence and really transformative projects out there. But I think it all comes down to ultimately communication, which, as a comms professional, I feel very passionately about. I think the worst thing we've done as an industry is just not tell the stories around identity and humanize it enough. So I think the more we read about the kind of things you talk about and the sort of books, it really helps to articulate what is a very human challenge. And the technology has its part to play, but we've actually got to start with the story of the human at the first. That's
wonderful way to finish. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thanks for your time, and we'll look forward to speaking again.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.